Love Across the North and South by Sebastian Reid. The autumn wind rustled through the maple trees surrounding Millbrook plantation, carrying with it the distant echoes of cannon fire. Margaret Lawrence stood on the wraparound porch, her fingers tightly gripping the painted railing as she gazed northward. The once peaceful Virginia countryside had transformed into a landscape of uncertainty, where every distant rumble could herald either salvation or destruction. At 22, Margaret had already witnessed more of war's sorrows than any young woman should. The elegant plantation house, once a center of Virginia society, now served as an impromptu hospital for wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. As the daughter of a prominent physician, she had learned to push aside her own fears to assist her father in treating the endless stream of injured men. Miss Lawrence called Sarah, one of the house servants, from the doorway. "Your father needs you in the library. They've brought in more wounded." Margaret gathered her skirts and hurried inside, the familiar scent of medical supplies and fresh bandages greeting her as she entered. The library's fine mahogany shelves, once filled with leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare and Milton, now held rows of medicine bottles and surgical instruments. Dr. James Lawrence looked up from his patient, his graying hair disheveled and his spectacles sliding down his nose. "Margaret, dear, we have 3 new arrivals. This young man here needs immediate attention." The soldier lying on the makeshift operating table wore a mud-stained Union uniform, his face pale beneath a layer of dirt and blood. Despite his enemy uniform, Margaret saw only a young man in pain, not so different from her own brother Thomas, who fought somewhere in Tennessee with the Confederate forces. As she began cleaning the soldier's wound, his eyes fluttered open, revealing striking blue irises that reminded her of summer skies before the war. "Am I dead?" he whispered hoarsely. "Because you must be an angel." Margaret couldn't help but smile, despite the gravity of the situation. "I assure you, Lieutenant, you're very much alive, though you've lost quite a bit of blood. I'm Margaret Lawrence, and you're at Millbrook Plantation." "Lieutenant James Harrison, 14th Connecticut Infantry," he managed, wincing as she continued her work. "Though I suppose being your prisoner is preferable to being dead in that field." "We don't take prisoners here, Lieutenant Harrison. We only treat patients." Over the following weeks, as autumn painted the Virginia countryside in brilliant reds and golds, Margaret found herself drawn to the recovering Union officer. James possessed both intelligence and humor, qualities that transcended the artificial divisions of North and South. During his convalescence, they spent evenings in conversation, carefully avoiding discussion of the war that raged beyond Millbrook's boundaries. James spoke of his home in Connecticut, of studying law at Yale before the war began, and of his hopes for reconciliation between the divided states. Margaret shared stories of her childhood at Millbrook, of the grand balls that seemed like distant dreams now, and of her own dreams of attending medical school, an ambition that had earned her more than a few raised eyebrows in Virginia society. "You would make an excellent physician," James told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "You have steady hands and a quick mind." "Perhaps in your Connecticut, but here in Virginia such things aren't proper for a lady," Margaret replied, though she couldn't keep the wistfulness from her voice. "The world is changing, Miss Lawrence. This war, terrible as it is, will reshape our nation in ways we can't yet imagine. Why shouldn't those changes include new opportunities for women of intelligence and capability?" Their conversations, though proper and often supervised by Sarah or other household staff, drew disapproving glances from some of the local families who still maintained social calls despite the war. Margaret found herself caring less and less about their opinions as autumn deepened into winter. The war, however, refused to remain a distant concern. In early December, word arrived that Union forces were advancing through the area. The Confederate Army was preparing for a major engagement, and all able-bodied patients at Millbrook would need to be evacuated. James, now fully recovered, knew he would have to leave. The night before his departure, he found Margaret in the library, cataloging their dwindling medical supplies. "I couldn't go without saying goodbye," he said softly, standing in the doorway with perfect military posture despite his recent injuries. Margaret set down her ledger, her hands trembling slightly. "I suppose it would be treason to ask you to stay." "For both of us." James stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "But when this war ends, and it will end, I'll return to Millbrook." "That's not treason, that's a promise." "Much can happen in war, Lieutenant Harrison. Promises are as fragile as autumn leaves in such times." "Then let me make you a different sort of promise." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small book of Tennyson's poems. "This belonged to my grandfather. Inside, I've written an address in Connecticut, my family's law practice. When the fighting ends, send word to me there. If we both survive this madness, if you still feel as I do, perhaps we can discover what might grow from these seeds we've planted here." Margaret accepted the book, holding it close to her chest. "And if the Union should lose, then I shall have to become very creative in finding ways to practice law in Virginia," he replied with a hint of his familiar smile. "Though I warn you, my knowledge of Southern law is somewhat limited." The moment hung between them, heavy with words unsaid and feelings that propriety and circumstance forbade them from expressing. Finally, Margaret stepped forward and straightened his uniform collar, allowing her fingers to brush against his neck for the briefest of moments. "Be safe, James Harrison," she whispered, "and remember that at Millbrook you will always find healing, not hatred." He caught her hand and pressed it gently. "Stay safe, Margaret Lawrence. Your courage gives me hope for what our country might become." The next morning she watched from the porch as James and the other recovered Union soldiers departed under flag of truce. The winter wind caught at her skirts and hair, carrying with it the perpetual distant thunder of artillery. 2 more years of war followed, years that transformed both the nation and those who survived its crucible. Margaret continued her work at the hospital, her skills growing with each passing month. She received occasional news of James through the underground network of medical professionals who maintained contact across enemy lines, learning that he had been promoted to captain, that he had survived Gettysburg, that he still carried a sketch of Millbrook in his breast pocket. When Richmond finally fell in early 1865, Margaret felt not defeat but relief. The killing would end, and perhaps the healing could truly begin, not just of bodies, but of the nation itself. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it brought with it a familiar figure walking up the maple-lined drive to Millbrook. James Harrison's uniform was now adorned with major's insignia, and a thin scar traced his left temple, but his smile remained unchanged as he caught sight of Margaret on the porch. "I believe," he called out as he approached, "that I promised to return when the war ended. Though I warn you, I'm still woefully uninformed about Virginia law." Margaret descended the steps slowly, dignity warring with desire to run to him. "Fortunately, I hear that Connecticut has some excellent medical schools. Perhaps we might reach a compromise on location?" "My dear Miss Lawrence," James replied, closing the distance between them, "I believe reaching compromise is precisely what this nation needs most right now." And there, beneath the maple trees that had witnessed both war's sorrows and love's quiet blooming, they began writing a new chapter, not just in their own story, but in the story of a nation struggling to become whole once more. In the years that followed, Margaret would indeed attend medical school in New Haven, while James built a law practice that specialized in helping both Northern and Southern clients navigate the complexities of Reconstruction. They maintained homes in both Connecticut and Virginia, raising children who knew both the proud traditions of the South and the progressive spirit of the North. Their story became one of many that helped weave together the torn fabric of a nation, proving that love could indeed bridge the deepest of divides. And on warm autumn evenings, they would often sit on Millbrook's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of pink and orange, remembering how hope had flourished in the midst of war, and how healing had come not just to bodies, but to hearts and to a nation. Looking back, Margaret would reflect that it hadn't been despite the war that they found each other, but because of it, because sometimes it takes the darkest of times to illuminate the brightest of human possibilities. Their love story became not just a tale of romance, but a testament to the power of seeing beyond uniforms and battle lines to the common humanity that binds us all. And so Millbrook stood, as it had always stood, a witness to history and healing, its maple trees whispering stories of a love that helped bridge a divided nation, one gentle word, one act of kindness, one shared dream at a time.